A gruesome discovery of a young woman's body in the Cambridgeshire countryside.
Police say it could well have lain hidden for 100 years, and that's why he chose this spot to dump the body.
Thousands of police interviews, but no one is charged.
What you know and what you can prove are often two different things. And so, after all of that work, sadly, the matter was ultimately filed as an undetected murder.
But the police never let the case go and vowed to get a breakthrough.
He was almost cocky. It's like, I got away with this for so long, of course I'll get away with it again. I got away with it at the time.
This murder town is Peterborough.
We're all keeping some secrets.
Killers are unpredictable. They can attack anyone at any time. Their motives are often varied. And chillingly, in a number of cases, their reason to kill is completely unknown. Some can be organised and planned with meticulous efficiency, whilst others are more opportunistic in their methods. They live amongst us in our towns and cities, and one thing sets them apart from the rest of society: their terrifying capacity to take someone's life. Welcome to Murdertown.
Do you feel it in the air? Everything is changing, a world wasted by fear. Something wicked this way comes, something wicked this way comes. It's been around since time began, a million times around our sun. Something wicked this way comes, something wicked this way comes.
This is Peterborough, a city in Cambridgeshire with a population of just over 200,000 people. It sits on the River Nene and is home to an impressive cathedral, the Church of St. Peter, St. Paul and St. Andrew, whose construction began way back in 1118.
Peterborough is very similar to a lot of cities its size. In the late 60s, it became a new town, and with that, there was a huge growth in, businesses like manufacturing. 30% of the workforce, I think, were involved in manufacturing in the 1970s, and since 1970, its population has grown by 110,000, so it's quite a sort of vibrant place. It's got quite a strong divide between rich and poor, which you see in a lot of places. But also that tends to bring with it a sense of community, perhaps more fractured communities, but a sense of community. Peterborough has the highest crime rate in the Cambridgeshire area, but having said that, that's not saying very much, because Cambridgeshire isn't a particularly dangerous county.
Peterborough was not the kind of city that you would say was the murder capital of the UK. It had no greater level of murder than any other city of its kind.
I don't think murders are the norm in the area. In cities, you see a lot of, crimes like burglary, petty theft, all of that, but murder stands out wherever it is.
Just in front of this impressive cathedral is this area known as Cathedral Square, which back in 1979 was one of the last places that a young 22-year-old woman called Sally McGrath would be seen alive.
Sally lived in Peterborough with her parents. Her parents were, clearly very close with her and, painted a picture of a very loving relationship that they had. Sally had quite an active social life, a wide circle of friends, a very personable, happy-go-lucky young lady, really, who had everything ahead of her to look forward to.
She had been working as a clerk, and she'd recently lost that position. So she was actively looking for work and signing on.
Sally McGrath lived here on Tower Street with her parents. She'd been going through a difficult time and struggling with unemployment. But on July the 11th, 1979, she headed into the centre of Peterborough for the day.
Sally woke up late. She woke up at about 11 and she got dressed to leave the house. She was wearing a blouse with flowers on, light blue jeans and calf-length cowboy boots. About 1 o'clock, she headed into town where she briefly talked to a friend of hers before heading into Peterborough to the employment exchange to sign on. After that, there's a sighting of her at 2:45 p.m. in the centre of Peterborough. But we next see her at about 3 in Westgate at the Bull Hotel in the Bullion Bar.
Sally's day out led her to this location, the Bull Hotel, in the centre of Peterborough.
Sally was a sociable young lady with a wide circle of friends. So I'm sure, an afternoon in a pub on a summer's day would probably be quite a pleasurable experience and something she was looking forward to, I would have imagined.
The following morning, though, when her mother woke up back in the family home on Tower Street, Sally was nowhere to be seen.
She didn't come home that evening. The next morning, when there was still no sign of Sally, we can all imagine every parent's worst nightmare starts happening.
Her mum was quite worried, and the following morning called the police to report her as missing. Despite Sally's mum explaining to them it was completely out of character for her to stay out overnight, the police took the view that staying away from home for a night wasn't something that caused them any huge concern.
What you have to remember is that she was 22. She wasn't a child. She was going out, she was seeing people. Perhaps she could stay at friends. Perhaps she was staying with boyfriends. It's not that long a time, especially in a time before you had mobile phones and in a time before people knew that they could, that they should make regular contact.
Sally's mum reported her as missing to the police, but her disappearance was initially treated as a simple case of a young woman running away from home, as opposed to anything more sinister.
In terms of missing people, it really depends on the vulnerability or how police assess vulnerability. Initially, police thought she'd run away. She was 22 and she was independent, and so their approach really would have been, OK, we'll put out a couple of feelers, see if anyone knows where she is. It was, don't worry, she'll be back when she's ready. Their daughter wasn't prone to just disappearing. If she went somewhere, she would normally tell them. She would have left a note or she would have told them in person. So for her parents, it must have been very scary. But then, of course, for the police, they had a different view of it.
If we go back to 1979, back in those days, a police investigation is very different to how it is now. You wouldn't have that instantaneous interaction like today, whereby, a single tweet on Twitter can get inundated with replies that gives you a story. You would have had to have done things the old-fashioned way, treading the pavements of Peterborough for information. The police were going around the pubs and clubs of Peterborough, speaking to people, getting witness statements, building up a picture. We all know that there was no CCTV in 1979. So, straight away, you can see that the investigation of those days would have been a bit different, would have probably been, fair to say, more difficult. As the days and weeks passed, the news cycle carries on and the story became less and less, and the trail kind of goes cold.
For just over 7 months, the disappearance of Sally McGrath was classed as a missing person case. Then on the 1st of March 1980, a discovery was made in this nature reserve by a local gamekeeper. It was the decomposing body of a young woman.
Police say it could well have lain hidden for 100 years. Hardly anyone comes to these woods apart from a pheasant shoot once a year. Police say the murderer may well have known that fact, and that's why he chose this spot to dump the body.
On the 1st of March 1980, the body of 22-year-old Sally McGrath was found here, in wild Boar Spinney Woods, around 8 miles from where she'd last been seen at the Bull Hotel in the centre of Peterborough. Her badly decomposed body was found by gamekeeper Keith Dickinson. She was naked, apart from a pair of boots. Sally had been missing for over 7 months, but her disappearance had been treated as a case of a young woman who had simply run away from home. So this discovery came as a huge shock.
Cast to Hanglands, it's just on the outskirts of Peterborough, roughly 10 or so miles perhaps from the city centre, so a little way out into the countryside. It's an area of natural beauty. I think I'm safe to say it's probably the same today as it was in 1979.
Not a lot really goes on there, it's quite remote. And within Castor Hanglands is an area called Wild Boar Spinney.
It's dense woodland, and you walk in there and it's like a silence comes over you. For a place that's so beautiful, it's quite eerie.
The gamekeeper was out hunting rabbits in Wild Boar Spinney. As he was walking through that area, his attention was drawn to something just sticking out of the ground. He went over to it, and it was one of Sally's boots.
A body that's found 6 months after that person goes missing is not going to be in a pleasant state. Sally had suffered 2 fractures to her skull and 1 to her nose. That then gives the police the start that enables them to start a murder inquiry.
Police say it could well have lain hidden for 100 years had it not been for a passing gamekeeper. Hardly anyone comes to these woods apart from a pheasant shoot once a year. Police say the murderer may well have known that fact, and that's why he chose this spot to dump the body.
Immediately after Sally's body had been discovered, a murder investigation was launched, with the post-mortem establishing that Sally's body had been in the woods for between 3 to 6 months. This brutal and savage murder shook the community. Detectives had to move quickly to find a killer still at large.
The investigation into Sally's murder, it was the biggest investigation ever conducted by Cambridgeshire Constabulary to that point. There were huge numbers of resources that were deployed, and the investigation would have been conducted in a not too dissimilar way to they are today. Forensic specialists would approach it. Sally's body would have been exhumed. They would have been taking soil samples. If there was anything associated with Sally's body, clothing and things like that in the immediate vicinity, that would have been seized. They would have been looking for footprints and tyre tracks, and they would have taken moulds of those. And then towards the end, once they'd satisfied they'd taken all of the samples that potentially were available to them, they would have conducted a fingertip search through the area to try and identify items which could have been relevant to the murder. So maybe things belonging to the victim, or items which may have been cast aside or dropped by the offender.
After several days of painstaking forensic work, the police were frustrated in their search for clues. With the crime scene yielding little to progress the investigation, detectives now turned their attention to the community and Sally's last movements, the place she was last seen, and the person she was last seen with.
An awful lot of work was done in this original investigation, which obviously would have started in 1979, and I think it ran into the early 1980s. It was speaking to witnesses, going around the pubs and clubs in Peterborough, building up a picture of Sally's final hours. Who were her friends? Had she done anything untoward in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance?
They took statements from over 10,000 people in the area, and of that, they had 3,000 people in for interview at the time. And I think quite early on, they had a sense that someone who they'd spoken to was responsible for it.
The suspect in this case came to notice of the police because he was one of the last people to be seen with Sally. Sally had been seen countless times throughout Peterborough during the morning of the 11th of July. And after being in the bar at the Bull Hotel, she wasn't seen again. But she was seen drinking with this individual.
The man last seen with Sally McGrath on the day she disappeared was Paul Taylor. He immediately became a suspect in Sally's murder, not just because he'd been seen with her on the night she went missing, but also because he was known to the police for having a violent history with women.
Paul Taylor was a young man who lived in the Peterborough area. He was married and was soon to start a family. He worked as a builder at the time. He had also served in the army. Again, like Sally, quite sociable, quite outgoing, a good-looking man. I think Paul made no secret of the fact that he liked the company of women.
He was known to exploit individuals, young females, look to isolate them in a social environment, and then potentially get them somehow into his car, offering them lifts. A lot of women, sadly, became a victim of his sexual offending in those circumstances. There'd been numerous allegations of rape made against him in the past. He was somebody with a history of offending, both in terms of dishonesty and also violence. So that individual then became the focus of that investigation.
At this time, Paul Taylor hadn't been found guilty of any sex crimes. Detectives today would rely on elements such as a digital footprint or other forensics to connect a suspect to the victim. But in the early 80s, that vital evidence wasn't available, and it quickly became clear that it would be difficult to find Paul Taylor guilty of murder.
Unfortunately, there wasn't too much in terms of evidence that existed by way of independent witness testimony. Bar Taylor being the last person to be seen with Sally in the bar at the Bull Hotel, after he left with Sally, there wasn't a sighting of them together. But what was significant was the fact that Taylor was on bail for offences of burglary, and that bail had conditions attached to it which required him every night to sign on at the police station at Peterborough. And during the entire period where he was on bail, the one night where he signed on much later than he should have done, and in fact rang the police station to apologise, was the night that Sally went missing. And an officer went out after he failed to sign on that night and was able to say that he knocked on the door and Taylor wasn't there. More importantly, his van wasn't there either, which would have normally been parked on his drive.
This proved to be significant when Paul Taylor's van was seemingly spotted in a different location.
There was a witness that was identified who was able to say that they'd seen a van that was very, very similar to Paul Taylor's van driving through the Castor area on the evening of the 11th of July. Now, bearing in mind this is a quiet village, Taylor's van was quite distinctive. That again was quite significant.
The case against Paul Taylor was starting to build, and the detectives were about to raise the stakes with even more compelling evidence based on old-fashioned police work.
Taylor, during the period of time between Sally's disappearance and the discovery of her body, he was convicted of the offences of burglary and was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. And the original inquiry were able to contact people that they knew that he had associated with in prison, and a number of those individuals made statements to say that he had made admissions associated with Sally's murder.
The evidence, although persuasive, was purely circumstantial. There was nothing that tied Taylor to the scene of the crime at this stage.
Probably the most significant link and event was that one of the victims of rape, who had been raped some weeks before Sally went missing, had been taken to Wild Boar Spinney, the exact location where Sally's body was ultimately found. So you can see that the evidence against Taylor from the original inquiry was quite significant. The difficulty with any crime investigation, and particularly murder, is that what you know and what you can prove are often two different things. And you have to factor all of that in when you decide whether, ultimately, you feel there's enough evidence to secure a prosecution. Taylor was interviewed whilst he was in prison about Sally's disappearance, and he denied any involvement with it. So the interview, along with everything else that the police had at the time, was discussed with a barrister. It was felt that there just wasn't quite enough to charge him with Sally's murder and put him before the courts. And so after all of that work, which was quite extensive and went on for some time, sadly the matter was ultimately filed as an undetected murder.
Despite the evidence that was gathered, it was deemed insufficient, and the police were unable to charge Paul Taylor for the 1979 murder of Sally McGrath. As a result, the case quickly went cold, and it would remain cold for nearly 30 years until a team of police officers vowed to solve this terrible crime.
Taylor leapt at him, put his fingers around his throat and started strangling him, and said, "If you ever tell anybody you see me with this woman, then I will kill you."
In 2009, Cambridgeshire Police launched a cold case review, codenamed Operation Highfield. It looked into 7 serious sexual offence cases and the killing of Peterborough local Sally McGrath, who had been brutally murdered 30 years earlier in 1979. Despite having been identified as a prime suspect, Paul Taylor had never been charged for the crime due to a lack of evidence. Leading the team was Detective Superintendent Jeff Hill.
These cold cases come up for review periodically, and when they do, they're considered in light of any new information, evidence, or intelligence. One of my detective inspectors who'd been allocated the case to be reviewed, he started telling me the story about the investigation. But the more he told me, the more I became convinced that this is something that we shouldn't be putting back into the system.
In the 1980s, once the Sally McGrath murder case had gone cold, the evidence against prime suspect Paul Taylor was put into storage. However, a flood meant that the majority of this had been destroyed.
I started to consider whether loyalties had maybe eroded over this period of 30 years, and whether people who had supported him at the time of the investigation may now be inclined to actually tell a different story. As a whole, it seemed to me that there was a really strong case first time round, and that it was probably a finely balanced decision not to prosecute. But we had the benefit these days of new techniques, of legislation which empowered us to some extent to introduce people's previous offending as evidence against them. I was very, very conscious of the potential for this inquiry not to progress successfully. But I've always been of the view, in all of my service, that fortune favours the brave, and you've actually got to do something positive to have a positive outcome.
But would this optimism be shared by the Crown Prosecution Service, who would make the call on whether or not the case should be reopened?
When you take a case like this to the CPS, you're dealing with facts. So your emotions have to be kind of left at the door. You know, like everybody, it just grips you. It's just not right. Somebody who had committed such a heinous crime had been having the best part of their life without being punished, having taken the life of somebody so young. I knew the strength of it, I believed in it, and I thought if we could get this in front of a jury, they would convict. But, you know, I have to some extent, step back from all of that and say, well, is my judgment distorted by the fact that I'm so heavily involved in it? And clearly that's the role that CPS play. They sit back and take a very objective view of things.
My name is Chris McCann. I was a solicitor employed by the Crown Prosecution Service since its inception in 1986. And at the time of this case, I was the head of the Complex Casework Unit for the East of England. I was brought onto the case sometime in 2011, and there was no additional evidence, such as DNA, which would have tipped the balance to make it a simple, straightforward case. It's the same evidence as existed in 1980. What has changed since 1980, when the DPP's office said no further action?
Chris was concerned that we had no central plank to our case. We've usually got CCTV or forensics or phones or, you know, a really compelling witness testimony. And Chrissy's view was that we didn't have any of that. And because we didn't have any of that, then, you know, we were going to struggle to convince a jury that Taylor was guilty.
Chris McCann wasn't convinced that he could overturn the decision made by the Department of Public Prosecutions. So Detective Superintendent Jeff Hill set about trying to find new evidence that would bolster the case. He started the investigation by tracing Paul Taylor's movements over the last 30 years since Sally McGrath's murder.
At some point after being released from prison, Taylor was divorced from his wife, who he lived with in Peterborough, and he moved away down to Hampshire. And in Hampshire, he set up a business with a new partner, and they ran a fish and chip shop in Fareham. So there's no doubt when Taylor moved away from Peterborough, he was leaving behind the reputation, the very negative perspective that people had on him. He had a criminal record, he was a violent individual, and being able to move completely away from the area gave him an opportunity to reinvent himself. So the people that I know that got to know Taylor in his new life down in Hampshire thought he was just a normal guy, a genuine fella, and there was nothing about him to be concerned about. There is no doubt that being aware that Taylor had divorced his wife was the catalyst for me to think, actually, there could be other people who were close to him at the time of this investigation who now may no longer be loyal to him. Given the fact that Taylor was no longer in Peterborough, no longer maybe had the influence and the hold over people maybe that he once did, I felt that that was a real opportunity. I knew that we needed something additional to what the original inquiry had. We needed a fresh witness or witnesses, or we needed existing witnesses to tell us something more. We knew that Taylor was a despicable individual who had terrible bad character, and we knew that the law would allow us to introduce that in evidence to prove his character, and that was a bonus for us, but that wasn't going to be enough.
As well as investigating the murder of Sally McGrath, Operation Highfield was also looking into numerous unsolved rape cases from the 1970s.
In the 70s, attitudes towards women were different, and that may be a factor in the willingness of women to report crimes of that nature because they would be concerned they wouldn't necessarily be believed, and I think a lot of that has now changed. One of the things that we were able to do is to contact some of the women who'd been victims of Taylor's sex offending. I'm not suggesting for one moment that the officers who dealt with them first time round weren't professional, but these days we train officers to be able to secure best evidence. So we were able to go and revisit these victims and be able to reassure them that we're going to take their allegations seriously and we're going to do our level best by them.
By re-interviewing Paul Taylor's rape victims, the police now had a number of witnesses who would be prepared to testify against him should the case go to trial. And these weren't the only people prepared to talk about him.
You have to remember that in the 70s, a lot of the people who he'd attacked and those people who he had influence over were quite young. You know, one of the women was 17, another was 19. And so over time, people grow up and they come to terms with what's happened to them and they get comfortable saying, this happened to me and I want to see someone caught for this and I know who did it, so come and get him, you know, and I'll give you what I know.
Jeff and his team were able to identify one key witness, a young male associate of Paul Taylor's from the 1970s when Taylor lived in Peterborough.
He at this time had a difficult life. His lifestyle was quite chaotic, and he said, I was a scared little boy 30 years ago. He said, but I'm not scared anymore. There's a lot I need to tell you.
If you're a predator, you sense the people who you can take advantage of and the people who are vulnerable. And so he'd have looked at this 16-year-old lad and he'd have thought he was perfect. He's never gonna tell people. And then you forget, of course, that over time he grows up and he doesn't care anymore and he's not scared anymore. And then he wants to talk about what he's seen because it must have defined a lot of his adult life.
That individual was able to give us some very, very good evidence and a really great account of events that he was a witness to. He was present when the rape had occurred up at Hanglands. We knew we were some way down the track to proving that Taylor was very familiar with that area, and it defied logic that Sally's body was just found there just through coincidence. That individual was also able to tell us that Taylor, during the murder investigation, had become absolutely transfixed with the reporting in the local newspaper. So much so that he commented to Taylor one day, "You seem to be so interested in this case, you sure you've got nothing to do with it?" At which point Taylor leapt at him, put his fingers around his throat and started strangling him and said, "If you ever tell anybody you've seen me with this woman, then I will kill you." He also told us that Taylor had paid him to clean his van the day after the murder had occurred, and to go in and clean it inside and out, and paid him what was seen to be a huge sum of money to do that. We were also told that Taylor hadn't met Sally on the 11th of July for the first time. He was present when Taylor met Sally a couple of weeks before. He met her in the street, he stopped his van, went across to Sally, chatted to her and took her phone number, which to some extent potentially gives some understanding as to why Sally might leave a bar with someone that she knew rather than somebody who necessarily was a stranger.
Another piece of key evidence came from an unlikely source, an old copy of the Peterborough Telegraph newspaper.
Jeff and his team were able to establish that the first edition of the paper following Sally's murder saw Paul Taylor placing an advert in the classified section.
Taylor was looking to sell his van, clearly with the intention of ensuring that it had gone to somebody else in case he was arrested, and obviously didn't want his van to be seized. So over a period of 3 years, we were able to build, I believe, a very, very compelling case against Taylor. I was always taught that there should be no difference between direct or circumstantial evidence. They have the same weighting, and the fact is that this case, presented correctly, defies logic that actually anybody else could be responsible for Sally's murder.
Over 30 years on from the murder of Sally McGrath in Peterborough Woodland,
Jeff Hill was confident he had enough evidence to put Paul Taylor in a courtroom, and made his case to the Crown Prosecution Service.
We approached CPS, we were allocated a lawyer. The lawyer worked with us and was as optimistic as we were about the case. But unfortunately, as the case progressed and we got to the stage where we were looking to arrest Taylor, there was a change of heart. Chris disappointingly said, "Look, guys, I know this is going to be a huge disappointment to you, but there just isn't enough."
He denied everything. He was almost cocky. You can turn around and you can say to one person, "How can you trust your memory from 30 plus years ago?" But you can't say that to 5 people.
In 2010, after a lengthy investigation into the cold case of Sally McGrath's brutal murder, Detective Superintendent Jeff Hill and his team had been unable to convince the CPS that the new evidence they'd collected against their prime suspect, Paul Taylor, was strong enough for a conviction. However, one lawyer at the Crown Prosecution Service was prepared to back them.
The difference between Jeff and myself was that I considered the evidence, and I was not satisfied. Can we overcome before a judge that decision by the DPP's office?
And Chris said, because this is clearly a very important case and because of the amount of work that's gone into this, I will pay for an independent review by counsel So if council comes back and says there's enough, prosecute, he said, we'll prosecute it. He said, but if council comes back and says there's not, he said, that's the end of the road, Jeff.
Very, very expensive cold case reviews are, and if it's going to go nowhere, then in those circumstances, then you're not going to pursue it. And that's why I was reluctant to approve a prosecution unless it was in the view of our appointed Queen's Counsel.
Then it went quiet for about 3 months. And just one afternoon, my phone went, and it was Chris at the end of the phone and said, council's advice is we've got enough and we're going to go for it.
On the 30th of November 2010, Paul Taylor was arrested and charged with the murder of Sally McGrath and a number of other serious sexual assaults.
He was taken from his home in Fareham to Cambridgeshire to be questioned.
But Taylor was quick to deny all charges.
He denied everything. All of the things brought against him, he's either said, I wasn't there, or the sex was consensual. And I think he was almost, cocky. So I got away with this for so long, of course I'll get away with it again. I got away with it at the time. I was interviewed at the time, didn't do anything. And I don't know for sure, but I think there must have been a sense of, well, regardless of this, what have they got? And of course, that's where it was so key that they had so many people. Because the thing is, you can turn around and you can say to one person, how can you trust your memory from 30 plus years ago? But you can't say that to 5 people.
Despite denying all the crimes he was accused of, Taylor was charged with 1 count of murder, 3 counts of rape, 1 count of attempted rape, and 1 indecent assault. On October the 10th, 2012, Paul Taylor's trial began at Chelmsford Court, and he entered a plea of not guilty to all the charges levelled against him.
During Taylor's trial, I did everything I could to be at court as often as possible. Taylor was present throughout, sat in the dock, listening quite intently, refused to give evidence. I don't think Paul Taylor ever thought he was going to be caught. He thought he was pretty much untouchable. The women that have been the victims of Taylor's sexual crimes very bravely gave some very compelling evidence. The one witness that kind of leaps out at me in terms of the drama at court was the witness who knew Taylor well and was able to tell us so much more about Taylor's behaviour. He gave his evidence, was challenged extensively by the defence about his honesty based on his previous convictions, his drug use, and he said something similar to, I am all of those things and I know what I am. Pointed to Taylor, he said, but he's a murderer and a rapist and he knows it and I know it. The actual trial process went on for about 7 weeks, and then the jury went out to consider their verdict.
Sometimes their decisions follow the evidence. Sometimes their decisions follow their heart. But over the decades as a prosecutor, you can walk through a court with a defendant who is charged with criminal offences that you think have a sufficiency of evidence, and the defendant walks out of the dock as a free individual because the jury have decided that there is insufficient evidence for them to convict. And that is how the dice is thrown with a jury system.
When the foreman came back in and was asked to stand and give their verdict, my heart was beating as fast as anybody else's in that courtroom.
After an 8-week trial, by the 4th of December 2012, following 23 hours of deliberation, the jury were finally able to give their verdict.
Paul Taylor was found guilty of Sally McGrath's murder, along with 3 counts of rape, 1 attempted rape, and a serious sexual assault. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years.
I think in murder investigations, when you secure a conviction, as much as there's a level of joy associated with it, there's a huge amount of sadness. Sally's family had spent 30 years not only thinking that the police were terrible at their job, but knowing that the offender was still at large, living his life when their daughter had been taken from them. You know, and that's tragic. Being in a position, I think, ultimately, where you can turn to the family and say, you can put a lid on it now. You know, that's special. We secured a conviction in a case that had no direct evidence, that had no forensics, no phones, no CCTV. We based it all on witness testimony. We held it together, sometimes with sticky tape and string, and the jury got it. And I suppose the reason I'm so proud is for a moment it could have gone the other way.
As someone who normally looks at unsolved cases, it is a really hopeful thing that a case can be solved after this long, especially because it wasn't solved through science. It is just good, in the end, good police work and being dogged and just keeping at it until they got their conviction.
I've been asked the question in the past whether I'm of the view that more could have been done at the time of the original investigation to put Taylor before the courts and put him in prison. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, they did everything that they possibly could. You know, the benefits that we have now of being able to introduce bad character evidence, as an example, didn't exist then.
After over 33 years, the murder of Sally McGrath was finally solved. Paul Taylor was found guilty of all charges, but it's terrifying to think that he was at large for over 3 decades. Thanks to the dedication of Chris McCann, Jeff Hill and his team, though, this dangerous individual is now safely behind bars.